Hi, welcome back to the Nero world. Today we are diving into another Nero Wolfe mystery. Smart, sharp, and worth every minute. There are exactly two things that will get Nero Wolfe out of his chair before 11 in the morning. And neither of them is a client. One is a fire. The other is Theodore Horstman hollering down from the plant rooms that something has gone wrong with the Miltonia hybrids. And even that only works about half the time. So when the doorbell rang at 9:40 that Tuesday morning in April, I knew before I got up from my desk that whoever was standing on the stoop was going to have to wait until Wolfe finished his eggs, his 4 newspapers, and his ceremonial descent from the orchid rooms at 11 o'clock sharp. War or no war. I went to the front door anyway, because that's what they pay me for, and looked through the one-way glass at a woman who had clearly dressed for an audition rather than an office visit. Mink stole in April, gloves so white they looked sprayed on, a hat with a little net veil that didn't hide much because it wasn't meant to. I put her age at 50, though the face had been worked on enough that I wouldn't have sworn to it in court. Mr. Wolfe is not available until 11, I told her, opening the door 6 inches, the standard opening gambit. I'll wait, she said, in a voice that had probably given orders to household staff for 30 years and expected them followed. My name is Cordelia Ashgrove Payne. I telephoned yesterday. I was told Mr. Wolfe would see me. I remembered the name from the appointment book, which meant Fritz had cleared her, which meant she'd have to be admitted regardless of my personal feelings about mink stoles in spring. I let her in, took the stole, parked her in the red leather chair, and went back to my desk to finish reading about a horse that had disappointed everyone at Aqueduct. At 11:06, I heard the elevator, and a moment later Wolfe came through the door from the hall, sat behind his desk, all 300 pounds fitting it the way a key fits a lock made for it, and rang for beer before he'd even glanced at our visitor. He looked at her the way he looks at most people, as though she were a species he hadn't yet decided was worth cataloging. "Madam," he said, "Archie tells me you have business with me. I should warn you at the outset that I am extremely reluctant to take on new work, and that my fee, should I accept, will not flatter your sense of economy." "I can afford you, Mr. Wolfe," she said. "My late husband left me comfortably situated, which is rather the point of why I'm here." Comfortably situated is not the same as safely situated, and I have begun to suspect the difference matters a great deal. That got a flicker out of him, not much, a half-inch lowering of the eyelids, but for Wolfe, that's practically a standing ovation. "Go on." She folded her gloved hands in her lap, like a woman about to recite something she'd rehearsed in the taxi. 11 days ago, a man named Walter Prine disappeared. Vanished. He has not been seen by his office, his housekeeper, his tailor, or, so far as I can determine, anyone at all since the evening of the 22nd. The police view this as a matter for concern? The police view it as a matter for a man of 48 who has run off with either his secretary or a great deal of somebody else's money, and are not troubling themselves further. She said it with the particular bitterness of someone who has already had this argument with a desk sergeant and lost. I do not believe either explanation. Walter Prine was the corporate secretary of Ashgrove Fabricating, my late husband's company, which I now largely control through my shares. And 11 days ago, he was the only person besides myself who had signed and countersigned the transfer documents finalizing the sale of a controlling interest to an investment group. Documents which, Mr. Wolfe, no longer exist. He poured it. Watched the phone settle with the attention of a man rationing his interest, and said, "Documents do not typically absent themselves along with the men who sign them, madam, without assistance." That is precisely my thought, and it is why I am here, rather than at a police precinct being told, again, that men leave their lives all the time, and I ought to consider myself well rid of an employee who was likely embezzling from me in the first place. Were the transfer terms unusually generous? To Prine, I mean, not the buyers. I saw where that one was headed before she answered, and so I imagine did she, because her chin came up a fraction. Walter had no financial stake in the transaction beyond his salary. He was not a shareholder. And yet he is the only witness to a contract that has since vanished with him, Wolfe said. That is either a remarkable coincidence, madam, or it is not a coincidence at all. And I confess I have never had much use for remarkable coincidences. Who benefits from the absence of these documents? That, she said, is exactly what I am paying you to determine. If the sale is not properly executed, my late husband's controlling interest in Ashgrove Fabricating reverts to me in full, rather than being divided among the buyers as the transfer specified. Which means, Mr. Wolfe, that I am aware I am my own most obvious suspect, and I would rather pay a great deal of money to a disagreeable genius to prove I am innocent, than sit quietly and let the district attorney reach that conclusion on his own timetable. I looked up from my notebook at that. It isn't often a client walks in and hands you the motive against herself, gift-wrapped, before you've even asked. Wolfe's expression didn't change, but I've worked for the man long enough to know that when he goes that still, something has snagged his attention the way a burr snags wool. Who else, he said slowly, stood to gain from the transaction's completion, and who else stood to gain from its collapse? There are 4 others with an interest close enough to matter. My stepson Gilbert, who believes the company should never have been sold at all, and has said so, loudly, at every family dinner since February. Miss Ellen Voss, who was Walter's assistant, and who I understand had ambitions toward him that were not entirely professional. Reginald Cray, who represents the buying group, and who does not strike me as a man who tolerates delay gracefully. And Dr. Simon Ashgrove, my brother-in-law, who sits on nothing, controls nothing, and yet always seems to know a great deal more about the company's business than a retired physician has any right to. You have given this considerable thought, Wolfe observed. I have had 11 sleepless nights in which to give it thought, Mr. Wolfe. That is rather the trouble. Wolfe finished his beer, set the glass down with the finality of a gavel, and folded his hands over the shelf of his stomach, the posture that means he's decided something, even if he hasn't decided to tell you what yet. My fee is $10,000, with expenses, payable regardless of outcome, and I retain sole discretion as to method. He let that sit a moment, the way he always does, to see if the number frightens anyone off. It didn't move her an inch. Archie will require the addresses of the 4 persons you've named, and I will want them here individually, at intervals of your choosing, but no later than tomorrow evening. I do not chase after facts, madam. I have them brought to me. And Walter? She asked, and for the first time her rehearsed composure slipped a little, showing something underneath that might have been real fear, or might have been very good acting. I hadn't decided which yet, and neither, I suspected, had Wolfe. Do you believe he's alive? Wolfe considered the question with the seriousness he usually reserves for the wine list. Madam, a man does not vanish along with the only paper that could convict someone of a serious fraud, unless one of 2 things is true. Either he vanished himself, taking the paper as insurance, or someone vanished him and took the paper as a precaution. I have, as yet, no basis for preferring one explanation over the other. I intend to acquire one. He glanced at the clock, which read 11:28, which meant lunch was closing in, and his patience along with it. Archie will show you out. Mrs. Ashgrove Payne, your retainer, if you please, before you go. I find promises considerably less nourishing than checks. She wrote it without a blink, which told me something about her bank balance if nothing else, and I walked her out to the stoop and watched her get into a car that had clearly been waiting the whole time, which meant she'd been that confident Wolfe would take the case, or that desperate. When I came back in, Wolfe was already halfway out of his chair, headed for the kitchen and Fritz's shad roe. And he paused only long enough to say, Archie, telephone calls this afternoon. I want to know everything obtainable about Ashgrove Fabricating, its sale, and its dead secretary's habits, before any of these people sit in that chair tomorrow. You think he's dead? I think, Wolfe said, already moving toward lunch, with the singular focus of a man who has solved the only problem that currently concerns him. That a man who disappears with a document worth killing for is a man who has either committed murder in advance, or is about to have one committed upon him. I have simply not yet determined which. Get me Mr. Cray's office number, and see that Fritz saves me the crisp parts of the shad. I sat back down at my desk, pulled the phone toward me, and thought that whatever else was true about Walter Prine, alive or otherwise, he had at least managed to interrupt Nero Wolfe's morning schedule 2 days running, which put him, dead or alive, in rarer company than he probably knew. Gilbert Ashgrove arrived first, at 4 the next afternoon, and made the mistake of trying to walk past me into the office, before Wolfe was down from the plant rooms. I stopped him in the hall, with a hand on his sleeve, and the sort of smile that tells a man you'd enjoy it if he pushed the issue. Mr. Wolfe doesn't receive visitors before 4, I said, which was a lie by 6 minutes, but I wanted the extra time to look him over. He was maybe 32, built like a man who played squash to stay ahead of a soft middle rather than out of any love of the game, and dressed in the kind of suit that costs more than it looks like it costs. He had his stepmother's chin, or she had his father's, and none of her composure. "This is absurd," he said. "I have a 4 o'clock tennis reservation. I've already had to move once for this." "Terrible inconvenience. A murder investigation," I said. "Have a seat in the front room, Mr. Ashgrove. It won't be long." It was, in fact, 11 minutes, which for Wolfe counts as breathless urgency. When I brought Gilbert in and settled him in the red leather chair, he sat like a man who'd never once in his life had to wait for anything, and resented the novelty of it. "Mr. Ashgrove," Wolfe said, without preamble, "your stepmother believes you opposed the sale of Ashgrove Fabricating." "I opposed it because it was a mistake, not because I had any scheme about it, if that's what you're implying." Gilbert crossed one leg over the other, a shade too quickly. "My father built that company from a machine shop in Queens. Cordelia sold it to a pack of financiers who'll strip the pension fund and sell the equipment for scrap within 18 months. I said so at every family dinner for 2 months, and I'm not going to apologize for having said it." "Did you say it to Mr. Prine?" The leg uncrossed. "What does Walter have to do with anything? He is missing, along with the only signed record of the transaction you found so objectionable. I should think that would interest you, rather a great deal, one way or another." "I barely knew Walter. He was Cordelia's man, not the family's. Polite enough at Christmas, kept to his ledgers the rest of the year." Gilbert's voice had gone flat in a way that struck me as rehearsed, the tone of a man reciting a version of events he'd practiced in a mirror. "If you're asking whether I had anything to do with his disappearing, the answer is no, and I resent the suggestion." "I have made no suggestion, sir. I have asked a question, which you have answered with considerably more heat than the question required." Wolfe reached for his beer with the unhurried calm of a man who enjoys watching other people grow warm. "You stand to gain nothing directly from the sale's collapse. I understand. The reversion benefits your stepmother, not you. I don't need to gain anything directly. I'd have been happy just to see the thing stopped." He caught himself a half-second too late, the way people do when they realize they've said something true they hadn't meant to hand over for free, and I saw his jaw tighten. "That's not what I meant." "It is precisely what you meant, and I thank you for the candor, however involuntary." Wolfe folded his hands. "That will do for the moment, Mr. Ashgrove. Archie will see you out." Gilbert left looking like a man who'd walked into a revolving door expecting a straight hallway, and I made a note in my head, under the heading of things worth remembering. Wanted it stopped. Didn't care who benefited. That's the kind of admission that sounds like nothing at a dinner party, and a great deal in a room with a corpse somewhere in its future. Ellen Voss came next, at 5, and she was a different proposition entirely, a woman of about 26, with the kind of composed, watchful face that belongs to people who have spent years being careful in rooms full of men who weren't. She sat in the red leather chair like she'd measured its dimensions in advance and found them acceptable. "Mr. Wolfe," she said, I want to say at the outset that I've already told the police everything I know, which isn't much, and I don't relish repeating myself for a private detective on Mrs. Ashgrove Payne's payroll. Then we understand each other's positions precisely, and can dispense with the preliminaries, Wolfe said. Prine's assistant for how long? 3 years. And your relationship with him was, I am given to understand, warmer than the strictly professional. Something moved behind her eyes, not shock, more like the weary recognition of a question she'd known was coming, and had already decided how to survive. Walter and I were close. I won't pretend otherwise, and I won't apologize for it either. He was going to leave his wife. We discussed it like adults, which is more than I can say for most of what happens in that office. When was this discussion? Weeks ago, before any of this happened. And on the evening of the 22nd, when he vanished? I left the office at 6. He was still at his desk, finishing the transfer paperwork, he said. I never saw him again. Her voice held steady, but her hands, folded in her lap, had gone white at the knuckles, which is the sort of thing a face can't fake nearly as well as a voice can. If you're going to ask whether I stole those documents to force his hand somehow, the answer is no. I never touched them. I wanted him to leave his wife, Mr. Wolfe, not disappear from his own life. An interesting distinction, and one I imagine feels less comforting now than it might have a fortnight ago. Wolfe's eyes had that particular half-closed look he gets when a fact has slid into place somewhere behind them, though he gave no sign of what it was. Did Mr. Prine ever express concern to you about the transaction itself? Doubts, reservations, anything of that nature? She hesitated, not long, but long enough that I marked it. He said about a week before that he'd found something in the paperwork that troubled him. He didn't say what. I assumed it was nothing, some accounting irregularity he'd sort out and forget. Walter worried about everything. It was rather his nature. Did he mention it to anyone else? Not that I know of, but he told Reginald Cray he wanted to meet privately the day before he disappeared. I only know because I placed the call for him. Her composure cracked there, just at the edges, like ice under a boot that hasn't quite given way. I've wondered since whether I should have asked him more about it. I didn't. I was thinking about other things. Wolfe let that sit in the room a moment, the way he does when he wants a silence to do work that questions can't. You have been considerably more forthcoming than Mr. Ashgrove, Miss Voss, whether you intended it or not. That will be all, for now. When she'd gone, I turned to Wolfe, who was studying the ceiling with the expression of a man doing arithmetic in his head. A troubled irregularity in the paperwork, I said, and a private meeting with Cray the day before he vanished. Yes, Wolfe said. Get me Mr. Cray on the telephone, Archie. I find I am rather more interested in his 4 o'clock tomorrow than I was an hour ago. Reginald Cray did not sit in the red leather chair so much as occupy it, the way a man occupies a boardroom seat he considers rightfully his. He was somewhere past 50, silver at the temples in a way that looked professionally maintained, and he had the particular calm of men who have spent careers being the most dangerous person in every room they enter. Mr. Wolfe, he said, I agreed to come here as a courtesy to Mrs. Ashgrove Payne, whom I still hope to do business with once this unpleasantness resolves itself. I hope you'll keep this brief. I keep nothing brief that requires thoroughness, sir, and murder, when it presents itself, requires a great deal of thoroughness. Wolfe watched him with the flat attention of a naturalist observing an unfamiliar beetle. You represent the investment group purchasing Ashgrove Fabricating. I do, and I'll say plainly what I told the police. Prine's disappearance is deeply inconvenient for me. The sale can't close without a proper accounting of that transfer document, and every day it drags on costs my clients money. I have no motive to make a bad situation worse. You had a private meeting scheduled with Mr. Prine the day before he vanished. I watched something flicker across Cray's face. Not alarm exactly, More the recalibration of a man realizing his hand held fewer cards than he'd assumed. He requested it. I didn't think much of it at the time. I assumed he wanted reassurance about severance terms, that sort of thing. Junior men in his position often do, once a sale's announced. And was that the substance of the meeting? We never had it. He canceled that morning, said something had come up, and I never heard from him again. Cray's voice had gone smooth again, too smooth, the tone of a man reading from the script he'd rehearsed for exactly this question. I assumed he'd simply gotten cold feet about the whole transaction and run off. Men in the middle of large financial matters sometimes do. Did he give any indication of what had come up? None whatsoever. Wolfe let the silence stretch, which is his favorite instrument, and Cray, to his credit, didn't fill it, a small data point in itself, since most people can't stand a silence in that office for longer than 10 seconds. Wolfe was reaching for his beer when the telephone rang, and I answered it because that's my job, and because Fritz was occupied with dinner. It was Inspector Kramer, and what he had to say changed the shape of the whole afternoon. I put my hand over the receiver. They found a body, in the East River near the 59th Street pilings. Fits Prime's description, and there's a signet ring on the hand that matches one his housekeeper described. Kramer wants to know why Nero Wolfe's been asking around about a missing persons case that just became a homicide. Wolfe's eyelids came down another half-inch, which for him is roughly the equivalent of another man leaping to his feet. Tell the inspector I shall be delighted to discuss the matter at his convenience, tomorrow, and not before. He turned back to Cray, who had gone very still in the red leather chair, the stillness of a man doing sums. You have just heard, Mr. Cray, that your inconvenient delay has become a good deal more than inconvenient. Mr. Prine is dead, and has apparently been so for some days. That's— Cray stopped, started again. That changes nothing about what I've told you. It changes everything about what I intend to ask you, Wolfe said. A man does not simply cancel a private meeting and vanish, sir. He is either frightened into silence or silenced permanently, and we now know which. You said he canceled that morning. By telephone or in person? Telephone. His secretary placed the call, as I recall. Miss Voss has already told me she placed a call for him to arrange the meeting, not to cancel it. She made no mention of a cancellation. Wolfe said this without any particular emphasis, the way another man might mention the weather. But I saw it land on Cray like a dropped plate. One of you is mistaken, sir, and I do not think it is Miss Voss, whose account of events has been considerably more precise than yours. Cray's jaw worked for a moment, before anything came out. I may be misremembering who placed the call. It was 11 days ago. I've had a great many calls since. You may indeed, Wolfe said, in a tone that suggested he thought nothing of the kind. That will be all for today, Mr. Cray. I expect we will speak again, and I would recommend you spend the interval refreshing your memory with rather more precision than you've managed so far. When Cray had gone, moving faster toward the door than his dignity probably wanted, Wolfe sat with his eyes closed for a full minute, which usually means he's either asleep or thinking harder than he wants anyone to notice. I used the time to write up what I had: a body in the river, a cancelled meeting nobody could agree on the details of, a troubling irregularity in the paperwork that had died with the only man who understood it. Dr. Ashgrove's interview is at 6, I said, when Wolfe opened his eyes. Want me to push it, given the news? No. I want him to arrive not yet knowing his relation is dead, and I want to watch what his face does when he learns it in this room. Wolfe rang for beer, which meant the interview would happen exactly on schedule, regardless of what corpses had turned up in the interim. There is nothing so instructive as an unrehearsed reaction, Archie. Rehearsed answers I can get from anyone. I am short on those that come before a man has decided what expression to arrange. Dr. Simon Ashgrove turned out to be a small, precise man in his 60s, with the dry, careful manner of someone who has spent 40 years being the calmest person in emergency rooms and has never quite managed to leave that manner at the hospital door. He settled into the red leather chair, folded his hands, and waited with the patience of a man used to waiting rooms. "Mrs. Ashgrove Payne tells me you take an unusual interest in company matters, Doctor, for a man who holds no shares and sits on no board," Wolfe said. "I take an interest because my brother built that company, and Cordelia sold it out from under his memory the moment she legally could," Dr. Ashgrove said, without heat, which was somehow more unsettling than if he'd matched Gilbert's temper. "I don't apologize for staying informed. Someone in that family ought to be." "You were in contact with Mr. Prine directly?" "Occasionally. He'd let slip things over the years. Not improperly, just the ordinary courtesies of a man who'd known the family a long time. He mentioned to me, perhaps 10 days ago, that he'd found something troubling in the transaction documents. I asked what. He said it was better I didn't know for my own protection, and that he intended to deal with it himself." Dr. Ashgrove's composure didn't so much as ripple. "I confess I found that rather melodramatic at the time. Walter was not a melodramatic man." Wolfe let this sit a moment before he delivered it. "Mr. Prine's body was recovered from the East River this afternoon, Doctor. He has, by the inspector's estimate, been dead for some days." I watched Dr. Ashgrove's face the way Wolfe had told me to, and what I saw was not shock. It was something closer to grim confirmation. The look of a man who had been braced for this news since roughly the moment Prine stopped answering his telephone, and was now simply relieved to have it delivered plainly, rather than carried around as a private dread. "I see," he said after a moment. "Then whatever he found, it was worth killing him for." "I rather thought it might be." He looked up at Wolfe with something almost like respect. "I don't suppose you'll tell me who did it." "Not yet," Wolfe said. "I do not yet know myself. But I will observe, Doctor, that you are the first person in this office today who has heard that news without either flinching or performing the flinch for my benefit. That is either the mark of an innocent man or a very controlled one. I have not yet determined which." Kramer came at 9 the next morning, before Wolfe was even down from the plant rooms, and I let him cool his heels in the front room, out of pure spite for the 6:30 phone call that had woken me. When Wolfe finally settled behind his desk at 11:01, Kramer was already red-faced with the particular impatience he reserves exclusively for this office. 11 days a missing person. Then a corpse in the river. And you've had 4 of my witnesses in that chair before I even knew there was a case worth working, Kramer said, not sitting down, which is his way of pretending he isn't planning to stay. "I want to know what you've got, Wolfe, and I want to know it now, not after you've built yourself a nice tidy speech for an audience. You will have everything I have the moment I have something worth giving you, Mr. Kramer, and not before, as you are perfectly aware is my custom," Wolfe said, without looking up from the beer Fritz had just brought. "I can tell you this much freely, since it costs me nothing. Mr. Prine discovered an irregularity in the transfer documents, roughly 10 days before his death, confided in no one the specifics, and arranged a private meeting with Mr. Cray that either did or did not take place, depending on whose account you credit. I find that discrepancy considerably more interesting than anything your medical examiner is likely to tell you about the state of a body after a week in the river." Kramer's jaw worked. "Cray says Prine's secretary canceled the meeting. The secretary says she never made any such call." "Precisely. Someone is lying, Mr. Kramer, and it is not, I think, Miss Voss, whose account has been consistent under 2 separate examinations, mine and presumably yours." Wolfe folded his hands. "I would suggest you occupy your considerable resources with Mr. Cray's whereabouts and telephone records for the evening of the 22nd, while I occupy mine with matters better suited to a chair and a functioning intellect. We are not in competition, sir. We are, on this occasion, merely proceeding at different speeds toward the same conclusion." It took another 10 minutes of Kramer threatening things he had no intention of doing before he left, and I sent him off with the small satisfaction of a man who'd gotten to watch someone else absorb Wolfe's particular brand of courteous stonewalling for once. At 2, I brought Cray back in, at Wolfe's insistence, and against Cray's very evident preference. And this time, Wolfe didn't let him settle before starting. You told me yesterday that Mr. Prine's secretary cancelled your meeting by telephone. Miss Voss states categorically that she made no such call. One of you is lying, Mr. Cray, and I should tell you plainly that I do not think it is she. Cray's composure, which had survived a night's sleep apparently unimproved, cracked at the corner. I may have confused the details. It was 11 days ago. You said that yesterday, and I found it unconvincing then. A cancelled meeting on the eve of a man's disappearance is not the sort of detail memory ordinarily discards, Mr. Cray, particularly for a man in your line of work, who I imagine remembers the terms of contracts signed a decade ago with considerably more precision. Wolfe's tone hadn't risen a note, which somehow made it worse. Did the meeting take place? The silence went on long enough that I started counting, and got to 8 before Cray answered. Yes, it took place. And what did Mr. Prine tell you? He said he'd found a second set of figures in the transaction ledgers. Figures that didn't match what had been presented to the board, or to Mrs. Ashgrove Payne, when the sale was approved. Cray's hands, I noticed, had found each other in his lap. Gripping in a way, his voice was trying hard not to match. He said the actual valuation used to structure the buyout was inflated well beyond the company's real worth, and that the difference was being siphoned to an account he couldn't trace past a holding company registered in Delaware. He wanted to know if I knew anything about it. Did you? No. And I told him so. Cray looked up, and for the first time since he'd walked into the office, something like genuine fear showed through the varnish. I told him to take it to Cordelia directly, that it wasn't my concern how the internal figures were structured, so long as the transfer itself was clean. He said he intended to. That was the last I heard from him. And you did not think, upon learning 11 days later that he was dead, to volunteer any of this to the police, or to me, until directly confronted with your own contradiction. I didn't want to be the last person known to have spoken to him before he disappeared, Mr. Wolfe. Wouldn't you have done the same? I would not, Wolfe said, because I do not make a habit of lying to men investigating a murder, having found the practice invariably costs more than it saves. You may go, Mr. Cray, though I would not go far. Mr. Kramer will want a rather fuller statement than the one you've given me. When Cray had gone, looking considerably smaller than he had walking in 2 days before, I turned to Wolfe. Inflated valuation, siphon difference, a Delaware shell, that's motive enough for half of Wall Street, let alone this crowd. It is motive for whoever structured the inflated figures in the first place, Archie, which is a considerably smaller set of people than half of Wall Street. Wolfe closed his eyes. The transaction documents themselves would show whose signature authorized the valuation used. Telephone Mrs. Ashgrove Payne. I want the original valuation report, the one presented to her board before the sale, and I want to know precisely who commissioned it. I made the call, and it took her office the better part of an hour to locate the report, which arrived by messenger at 4, with a covering note in Cordelia Ashgrove Payne's own hand. This was commissioned and reviewed by our internal accountant at the request of the corporate secretary. I did not review the underlying figures myself. I trusted Walter's judgment on such matters entirely, which I now realize may have been an error costing him his life. Wolfe read it twice, set it down, and sat very still for a long moment, the particular stillness that means some piece of the puzzle had just clicked into a slot he hadn't previously known existed. Archie, he said finally, it appears our victim commissioned, or at minimum approved, the very figures he later claimed to find troubling. A man does not typically discover fraud in a report he wrote himself, unless he did not write it at all, and has only just learned that someone used his authority to produce it without his knowledge. Somebody forged his sign-off, or used it with his knowledge and later regretted the arrangement, which amounts to much the same difficulty for our purposes. Determining who had access to his signature, his authority, and his confidence, in sufficient measure to make such a substitution possible. Wolfe opened his eyes. "Get me Miss Voss again, Archie. Tomorrow morning, and don't tell her why. I find I am considerably more interested in what she knows about her employer's handwriting than I was in what she felt about his marriage." Wolfe wanted Ellen Voss back in the office, but he also wanted, before she arrived, something only legwork could get him. A look at how Walter Prine's authority actually moved through that building. Who could forge a signature or slip a false report past a board? And who had the run of his files closely enough to manage it? That meant me, out on the street, instead of Wolfe in his chair, which is roughly how the division of labor in that partnership has always worked, and always will. Ashgrove Fabricating occupied 4 floors of a decent but unglamorous building on Lexington, the kind of place where the elevator operator still calls you sir, and means it. I told the receptionist I was there about Mr. Prine's affairs, on behalf of Mrs. Ashgrove Payne, which was true enough not to sit badly on my conscience, and got shown up to what had been his office, a corner room, still with his coat on a hook by the door, the particular eeriness of a workspace waiting for a man who was never coming back to claim it. The current occupant, temporarily, was a nervous junior accountant named Feld, who'd been handed Prine's files and told to make sense of them until someone more senior got appointed. He was maybe 25, sweating slightly despite the office being perfectly cool, and altogether too eager to talk to a stranger who claimed some authority over the mess he'd inherited. "Who had access to files like this besides Prine?" I asked. "Miss Voss, obviously. She typed half of what he dictated. And Mr. Cray's people, since they needed copies for their own due diligence. And," Feld hesitated, the particular hesitation of a young man about to say something he suspects will get him in trouble. "Dr. Ashgrove used to come by sometimes, in the evenings, after most of the staff had gone. He and Mr. Prine were friendly, I always thought, from the old days, when Mr. Ashgrove Sr. ran things. I saw him in this office more than once, working late with Walter over the ledgers." That was a new piece, and not one anyone had volunteered so far. Not Dr. Ashgrove himself, who'd been so careful to paint himself as an outsider, merely staying informed out of family loyalty. No shares, no board seat, nothing to gain. I thanked Feld, took the folder with his nervous permission. He seemed relieved to hand off the responsibility of it to somebody, anybody, and went down to talk to the elevator operator and the night doorman, because Wolfe's methods start with the chair, but mine still start with people who watch buildings for a living and remember more than anyone gives them credit for. The doorman, a heavy-set man named Petrocelli, who'd clearly been asked about this before and enjoyed the attention, told me Dr. Ashgrove had indeed been a regular late-evening visitor in the weeks before Prine disappeared, sometimes twice a week, always leaving after Miss Voss and the other staff, sometimes not until 9 or 10 at night. "And the night of the 22nd?" I asked. "The night Mr. Prine was last seen." Petrocelli scratched his chin. "Funny thing, Dr. Ashgrove was here that night too, left around 8:30 I remember, because I was thinking about my dinner, and he held me up asking about the weather, whether it'd rain on his walk. Mr. Prine left maybe 20 minutes after, alone, like always. That's the last I saw of him." I called Wolfe from a drugstore phone booth 2 blocks away, because some things don't keep for the walk home, and read him what I had. The 2 valuations, Dr. Ashgrove's late visits, his presence in the building the very night Prine vanished, despite his insistence to Wolfe's face that he held no position and merely stayed informed as a matter of family principle. There was a silence on the line, long enough that I thought we'd been cut off. Then Wolfe said, "He described Prine's melodrama as unlike the man's nature, Archie, with the particular fondness of someone who knew that nature intimately, from evenings spent precisely where your doorman places him. A man who sits on no board and holds no shares has no obvious motive to falsify a valuation report, which is presumably why none of us pressed him on the point. But a man who resents his brother's company being carved up by financiers, and who has spent years quietly nursing that resentment in evening visits nobody thought to mention until today, might find considerable satisfaction in engineering a transaction so poisoned by fraud that it collapses entirely, returning control to the family rather than to strangers with a controlling interest. You think he inflated the figures himself? Using Prine's office? Maybe Prine's own hand guiding it before Prine understood what he was really being asked to sign off on? I think it is the first explanation that accounts for all of it. His access, his motive, his presence that night, and his conspicuous lack of the ordinary human flinch when told a man he had visited fondly for years had been fished out of the river. Come home, Archie. I want that folder in front of me. And I want Miss Voss here, at 10 tomorrow morning, to tell me finally about her employer's handwriting and his habits with a fountain pen. I begin to suspect Dr. Ashgrove's alibi for that evening will prove considerably less solid than his composure. I got home a little past 6, dropped the folder on Wolfe's desk, and found him already deep in the particular posture he adopts when he's building something in his head, brick by brick. Eyes closed, fingers laced over his stomach, lips occasionally moving in and out as though he were tasting the thought before committing to it. I've learned not to interrupt that posture except with facts, so I gave him the doorman's account word for word, and the 2 valuations side by side, and then sat down and waited. "Read me the higher figure again," he said, without opening his eyes, the one presented to the board. I read it. And the discarded figure, the one Feld found tucked behind it. I read that too, and the gap between them, call it 40% near enough, sat in the room like a bad smell. A 40% inflation is not the work of a careless bookkeeper, Archie. It requires deliberate construction, invented comparables, adjusted multipliers, the sort of thing that takes hours of quiet, unsupervised work with a company's books, by someone who understands precisely how such figures are built and precisely how to make them survive a board's casual scrutiny. Wolfe opened his eyes. Dr. Ashgrove is a physician, not an accountant. He would need Prine's genuine expertise to make the fraud convincing, and Prine's genuine signature to make it stick. Which suggests to me that for some period, Prine was either a willing accomplice or an unwitting one. Feld said they were friendly from the old days. Maybe Ashgrove convinced him it was for the family's benefit somehow. Some scheme to keep the company out of Cray's hands entirely by making the deal too rotten to survive scrutiny. That would explain both the fraud and Prine's later crisis of conscience. A man persuaded to falsify figures for what he believed a righteous cause, preserving his old friend's brother's legacy, might tolerate the deception for months, only to discover, upon closer inspection of where the difference between real and reported value was actually flowing, that it was not vanishing into thin air for the noble purpose of collapsing the sale. It was flowing somewhere, into an account, a Delaware holding company by Cray's account, which Prine could not trace past its registration. Ashgrove's been quietly bleeding the transaction himself, I said, not to wreck the sale out of family loyalty, to profit from the inflation before anyone noticed, and let Prine take whatever fall came due if it unraveled. That is my present working theory, yes, though I want it a good deal more solid before I present it to anyone, least of all Mr. Kramer, who will want it airtight before he'll trouble himself to act on it. Wolfe reached for the folder again, studied the 2 valuations with the particular squint he uses when he's genuinely working rather than performing thought for an audience. Prine discovered the deception, or discovered its true purpose, having perhaps believed it served a nobler one, and confronted someone with it. Not Cray, evidently, since Cray professed ignorance, and I find myself inclined to believe him, for once given how thoroughly frightened he looked at the prospect of being tied to it. Prine went to the one person who had helped him build the false figures in the first place. And that conversation didn't go the way Prine hoped. No, I should think it went a very great deal worse than that. Wolfe closed the folder. Consider the timeline, Archie. Prine tells Dr. Ashgrove he intends to take his discovery to Mrs. Ashgrove Payne. Precisely what he told Cray he planned to do. Ashgrove cannot allow that. The moment the fraud surfaces, an investigation follows the money, and the money leads eventually to him. He arranges to see Prine that final evening. The doorman places him in the building until 8:30. Holding up conversation about rain with a doorman is, I would note, an excellent way to fix a precise and innocent-seeming departure time in a witness's memory. Prine leaves 20 minutes later, alone, and is never seen again until the river gives him up 11 days later. You think Ashgrove killed him inside the building and moved the body afterward? I think it considerably more likely he arranged to meet Prine again, after his ostensible departure, somewhere less observed than a lobby with a doorman standing in it. A physician would know a good deal about how a body behaves, how long it takes to be found in moving water, how to avoid the sort of forensic evidence that would tie a death conclusively to a particular hour and place. That is speculation, Archie, and I dislike presenting speculation as conclusion. I want it tested before I trust it. How do you test a theory like that without a confession sitting in the chair across from you? Wolfe's eyes had that particular gleam that means he's already 3 moves ahead and enjoying the wait before he shares it. I intend to have Dr. Ashgrove sit in that chair once more, Archie, and I intend to tell him, in front of witnesses he does not expect, precisely what Miss Voss discovered about her employer's handwriting habits this morning, which I have not yet asked her about, but which I am confident will prove instructive. A man who has committed one careful, deliberate fraud, and one considerably less careful murder to protect it, does not respond well to being told the details of his own scheme by someone who is not meant to know them. I want to watch what his face does when the ground he believes solid turns out to have been mapped without his knowledge. A trap. A demonstration, Wolfe said, with the particular dignity of a man who dislikes the word trap applied to his own methods, however accurately. Telephone Mrs. Ashgrove Payne, Archie. I want all 5 of them here tomorrow evening. Gilbert, Miss Voss, Mr. Cray, Dr. Ashgrove, and the widow herself. I find I am nearly ready to stop asking questions and begin answering them, but I want one more piece first, and Miss Voss has it, whether she yet knows it or not. Ellen Voss came in at 10 the next morning, looking like a woman who'd hoped she was done being summoned to that office, and was disappointed to learn otherwise. Wolfe didn't waste time on courtesies. Miss Voss, I want you to examine something for me, and I want your professional judgment, not your personal feelings about the matter. He nodded at me, and I laid the 2 valuation reports on the desk in front of her, side by side. You typed a great deal of Mr. Prine's correspondence, and I should think came to know his working habits with considerable intimacy. Tell me, which of these 2 documents he actually drafted himself? She leaned forward, and I watched her go from mildly puzzled to genuinely absorbed, the way a person does when a question finally lands on ground they actually know something about. This one, she said, tapping the lower figure, the discarded one Feld had found tucked behind its inflated twin. Walter had a habit of underlining his subtotals twice when he was satisfied with a number, and once when he wasn't sure of it. Look, every subtotal here is underlined twice. Confident work, his own figures, arrived at carefully. She pushed the higher valuation an inch away from her, as though it had gone slightly sour. This one has no underlining at all. That's not how Walter finished a report he'd built himself. This looks like it was typed from figures somebody else provided, and he simply transcribed them onto his letterhead, without ever actually working the math through in his own hand. Did he ever ask you to type such a report? One where he dictated numbers you understood him to be receiving from someone else, rather than deriving himself? She was quiet a moment, and I could see her deciding how much loyalty a dead man was still owed. Once, about 6 weeks before he disappeared, he seemed uncomfortable about it, more careful than usual, made me redo the cover page twice, for reasons I couldn't understand at the time. He said Dr. Ashgrove had asked him to run some comparables through, as a favor, since the doctor didn't trust the outside valuation firm the board had hired, and wanted a second opinion he could rely on personally. She looked up. I assumed it was exactly that. A family friend wanting reassurance. I never thought. No, Wolfe said, nor I think did Mr. Prine, until considerably later than was good for him. That is precisely the piece I required. He arranged the evening for 7, and by 7:15 the office held more tension than I'd felt in it in months. Cordelia Ashgrove Payne in the chair nearest Wolfe's desk. Gilbert beside her, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. Cray perched at the far end with the stillness of a man who has decided silence is his safest strategy. Ellen Voss near the door, and Dr. Simon Ashgrove in the red leather chair itself, composed as ever, hands folded, waiting with the patience of a man who has spent a career in waiting rooms, and sees no reason this one should be different. I have asked you all here, Wolfe began, because I have arrived at a theory of Mr. Prine's death that I believe to be substantially correct, and I wish to test it before an audience rather than announce it to Mr. Kramer, without confirmation. He let his eyes move slowly around the room, landing last and lightly on Dr. Ashgrove. The valuation figures used to structure the sale of Ashgrove Fabricating were falsified, inflated by some 40% above the company's genuine worth. Mr. Prine did not construct this fraud, though his signature authorized it. He was asked, as what he believed a personal favor to an old family friend, to run comparables and lend his professional credibility to figures that had in fact been supplied to him already assembled. Dr. Ashgrove's face did not change, but his hands, I noticed, had gone very still in his lap. The stillness of deliberate effort, not natural calm. Miss Voss confirms, from Mr. Prine's own working habits, that the report submitted to the board bears none of the marks of his genuine analysis, while a discarded draft, his true figures, arrived at independently, was found buried in his files some 40% lower. Wolfe's voice had settled into the unhurried rhythm it takes when he is genuinely certain, rather than merely probing. Mr. Prine discovered, some 10 days before his death, that the difference between these two figures was not, as he may once have believed, being directed towards some scheme to collapse a sale he considered a betrayal of the founder's memory. It was being diverted into a Delaware holding company, for the private benefit of whoever had supplied the false comparables in the first place. He confided his discovery to Mr. Cray, seeking confirmation of what he already suspected, and Mr. Cray, to his credit, told him he knew nothing of it. Mr. Prine then did what an honest, troubled man does. He went to confront the friend who had asked the favor of him, intending, as he had already told 2 other people, to take the matter to Mrs. Ashgrove Payne directly. This is conjecture, Dr. Ashgrove said, his voice as dry and level as it had been on his first visit. Interesting conjecture, Mr. Wolfe, but conjecture nonetheless. It was until this afternoon, when your doorman's memory of the evening of the 22nd placed you in that building until 8:30. A departure time you took some care to fix precisely in his mind, discussing the weather with a man you had, by your own account, no particular reason to linger with. Mr. Prine left 20 minutes after you, alone, according to every account but one. I put it to you, Doctor, that he did not remain alone for long, that you had arranged to meet him again, away from that lobby and its doorman, precisely because you knew he intended to expose the very fraud you had spent months constructing. Not to save your brother's legacy from strangers, as you told me yourself, sitting in that very chair, with a composure I mistook at the time for grief rather than what I now believe it to have been, which was relief that the discovery had, however briefly, seemed to have died along with the man who made it. The room had gone very quiet. Cordelia Ashgrove Payne was staring at her brother-in-law with an expression I couldn't quite place. Not shock, More like the slow arrival of a suspicion she'd been holding at arm's length for 11 days, and could no longer keep there. "You have no proof of any meeting," Dr. Ashgrove said, and for the first time his voice had lost some of its dryness, gone thinner, tighter. "A doorman's memory of a conversation about rain is not evidence of murder, Mr. Wolfe." "No," Wolfe agreed, "it is not. Which is precisely why I have not yet finished, Doctor, and why I would ask you to remain seated a moment longer, while Archie telephones Mr. Kramer, who I believe will want to hear what the medical examiner's office has to say about a detail I asked him to confirm only this afternoon. One concerning the particular chemical treatment of a certain physician's private dispensary, and its presence in a dead man's remains." I hadn't heard about any such call, and neither from the look on his face had Kramer, when I finally got him at 8:40. But Dr. Ashgrove's composure, for the first time since he'd walked into that brownstone, broke clean through, and in the silence that followed, I understood that Wolfe had just fired a shot into ground he wasn't entirely sure was mined, and hit something anyway. For a man who'd spent 30 seconds staring down what he clearly believed was a piece of physical evidence tying him to a corpse, Dr. Simon Ashgrove recovered his composure with impressive speed, but not quite fast enough. I've watched a good many faces come apart in that office over the years, and there's a particular sequence to it. First the stillness, then the calculation, then the small defeated slump of a man who has just realized calculation won't save him. I saw all three pass over the doctor's face in about 4 seconds, and Wolfe, who misses nothing, saw them too. "There is, of course, no chemical finding from the medical examiner's office," Wolfe said, once the silence had done its work. "I invented it, Doctor, on the reasonable supposition that a man who has genuinely done nothing wrong receives such a claim with confusion or indignation, while a man with something specific to hide receives it with fear directed at that particular specific thing. You did not ask what chemical, or from what dispensary, or how such a finding could possibly implicate you. You simply went white, which tells me you already know precisely what substance you used." Ashgrove started, and then stopped, because there was nowhere useful for the sentence to go. "A physician has access to a great many compounds, capable of inducing unconsciousness quietly, without struggle, without the sort of noise or violence that draws attention in a lobby with a doorman standing 20 feet away," Wolfe continued, in the same unhurried voice he might have used to discuss orchid soil. "I imagine you met Mr. Prine again that evening, somewhere private, ostensibly to discuss his concerns as the old friend he believed you to be. I imagine the conversation went the way such conversations do, when one party has already decided it cannot be permitted to continue. And I imagine the river did the rest of your work for you, over 11 days, rather more thoroughly than you had hoped, though not thoroughly enough to prevent Mr. Kramer's people from noting whatever it is you just confirmed for me by the color you have gone." "You bluffed," Dr. Ashgrove said, and there was something almost admiring in the accusation, the professional respect of one careful man for another's craft. "I did. It is a technique I employ rarely, and only when I am already substantially certain of the underlying truth, so that the bluff merely confirms what the facts have already told me, rather than manufacturing a falsehood from nothing." Wolfe's eyes hadn't left him. "You inflated the valuation figures using Mr. Prine's genuine expertise and unwitting signature, diverted the difference to a Delaware entity for your own benefit, and allowed your family, your brother's widow, your nephew, all of them, to believe you cared only for the company's memory, when in fact you had simply found a discreet way to profit from its sale twice over. Prine discovered the deception, confronted you as a friend rather than an enemy, gave you the chance to make it right, and you repaid that decency by ensuring he would never have the chance to expose you." Cordelia Ashgrove Payne had gone very pale in her chair, and Gilbert had stopped looking bored some minutes back, and was now staring at his uncle with the particular horror of a man realizing the person he'd spent 2 months arguing with about a company sale had, all along, been a considerably more dangerous problem than the sale itself. "Simon," she said, quietly, "tell me this isn't true." Dr. Ashgrove looked at her for a long moment, and whatever remained of his composure finally went out of him all at once, the way a light goes out rather than dims. He was going to ruin everything, he said, and his voice had lost the dry, measured quality it had carried through every prior visit to that office. "Not the sale, Cordelia. My arrangement. 2 years of careful work, moved through accounts he'd never have found if he'd simply trusted me the way he always had. He came to my house that night, practically in tears, asking me to explain it, giving me the chance to make it right, as Mr. Wolfe says. I told him I would. I asked him to meet me again after, so I could show him the accounts myself, prove it was a misunderstanding." He stopped, and something like genuine grief moved across his face, the first entirely unguarded expression I'd seen from him. "It wasn't supposed to go that far. I only meant to buy time to think. But once he was unconscious, I understood there was no version of events after that where he woke up and I remained safe, and He didn't finish, and nobody in that room asked him to. Kramer arrived 20 minutes later, having driven over the moment I telephoned him with rather more urgency than my earlier bluffed call had implied, and took Dr. Ashgrove into custody, with the particular grim satisfaction of a man collecting a case Wolfe had built for him without troubling him for any of the labor. He gave Wolfe a look on the way out that mixed irritation with something almost like gratitude, which is about as close to thanks as Kramer's ever come in that office, and probably ever will. Cordelia Ashgrove Payne stayed behind after the others had gone, sitting very still in the chair she'd occupied on her first visit, looking considerably older than she had walked in. "I came here afraid you'd prove I killed him," she said finally. "I never once considered it might be Simon. He was the one person in this whole business I thought had nothing to gain." "That, madam, is generally the most dangerous assumption available to a client," Wolfe said, not unkindly. "The man who appears to want nothing is often merely the man who has already arranged to take everything, quietly, before anyone thought to ask what he wanted at all. Your check, when convenient. I find the matter concluded to my satisfaction, if not entirely to yours." She left a little after 9, and Wolfe rang for his last beer of the evening with the particular contentment of a man whose schedule had finally been permitted to return to its proper order. "You bluffed a murder charge out of a man on nothing but his own face," I said once she'd gone. "That's a hell of a thing to hang a confession on." "I bluffed a detail, Archie, not a conclusion. The conclusion I had already reached honestly, through Miss Voss's knowledge of underlining and subtotals, your doorman's memory of idle conversation about rain, and a man's inability to leave off practicing the role of grieving relative even when no one remained in the room to perform it for." Wolfe closed his eyes, the beer settling, the day settling with it. I merely required him to confirm, in the one unguarded second available to me, what the facts had already made plain. A good bluff, like a good orchid, requires the proper soil already in place before you plant it. Anything less is merely gambling, and I do not gamble, Archie. I calculate, and occasionally I calculate quickly enough to look, from the outside, like something more dramatic. That's exactly what I'll tell Kramer next time he asks how you do it. Wolfe didn't answer, which meant dinner was next on the agenda, and the conversation, so far as he was concerned, had already concluded some minutes before I'd noticed it had. I put the cover back on the typewriter, thought about Walter Prine, honest enough to confront a friend, and unlucky enough to trust him one evening too many, and went to see what Fritz had done with the duck.